Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to present Rob Brera. Rob is the Education Program Specialist at Homestead National Historical Park. Prior to this position, he has worked as a park ranger at the Voyageurs National Park and Theodore Roosevelt National Park, an education technician at Mount Rushmore National Memorial, and as a geography instructor within Montana and Texas public university systems. He believes education as it occurs through public land is a flexible means to connect audiences to a more inclusive American story. Today's presentation is titled Black Homesteaders in Nebraska, Audacious Dreams. The Homestead Act of 1862 provided African Americans with the prospect of land and home ownership, an attractive alternative to racial violence and social disenfranchisement in the post-Reconstruction South. In Nebraska, independent Black homesteaders built successful farms from eastern tallgrass prairies to the arid sandhills in the west. Black homesteaders also created intentional communities like Audacious. In this presentation, a park ranger will discuss how Nebraska's geography and history shaped and was shaped by the experiences of the Black homesteaders. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Rob.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am an education program specialist in and at Homestead National Historical Park in Nebraska, and we are located in Beatrice, Nebraska. So before I dig into the content of my presentation today, I want to situate my background knowledge because that definitely shapes the scope of my knowledge and what I'll communicate with you today. And that is that I am a trained historical geographer who has been on site here at Homestead National Historical Park since about November of this past year. So still learning, and every time I get an opportunity to speak with adult audiences, I really love it because oftentimes I learn just as much from you guys as maybe I communicate to you. And then one little bit of housekeeping, or two pieces of housekeeping, is that I have terrible allergies right now. And so if I am holding something up to my nose, that's why. And then you may hear a chiming throughout the course of the day. And that's because we are on the cusp of a major event here at Homestead National Historical Park. And there's a lot of activity coming in and out of the doors on site. So forgive the atmospheric noise if that comes through on your end. And yeah, there we are. So for those of you who may not have been to Homestead National Historical Park, we are located approximately where that red and gold star is. We're one of over 420 national park sites in the United States, and national park sites tell national stories. And the story of the Homestead Act of 1862, which is commemorated by this site outside of Beatrice, Nebraska, is one of national importance. The map behind me has two major colors on it, right? In that dark green, those are non-homesteading states. And all of the brown states on the map, those are states that had homesteaders on them. If you count them up, there's 30. If you need a refresher on the Homestead Act, it was a law signed into effect by President Abraham Lincoln. And it said this: if you were 21 or head of household, if you were an American citizen or intended to become one, and if you had never borne arms against the United States, then you could apply for up to 160 acres of the federal domain. And that land would become yours if you improved it, which in 1860s parlance was the equivalent of planting that ground with agricultural crops, if you built a house of a certain size, and if you lived on that land for 5 years with witnesses. Now, the map behind me is definitely a Euro-American map. It is one that demonstrates the United States and its internal political boundaries. That is, the states that we see there. When the Homestead Act is written into law, it is a federal law that does not recognize that there are already occupants on that land. And so the Homestead Act does have a massive impact on Native American lifeways across the United States. And it occurs hand in hand with the rise of the reservation system that we see in the United States today. And then when you think about another massive disruption to the United States and what becomes the United States, you see that when you create a whole lot of farmers who are homesteading, ecologies are disrupted. And farmland transforms much of the American West and Midwest. I'm happy to geek out about that a little bit, as well as any impacts impacting Native American reservations as well. And then you have homesteading experiences. They are diverse, but homesteaders and those seeking to become American citizens oftentimes find their way into American urban spaces. And so all through the 1870s and 1880s, you see waves of European migration to the United States. And many of these migrants are seeking paths to citizenship, and they are seeking homesteading opportunities. And so those states in green, even if they aren't necessarily homesteading states where homesteading occurs, they are nonetheless states shaped by the Homestead Act. And we can think about cities in more depth. Homesteading is thought of as a rural phenomenon, yet cities produce the materials that homesteaders are consuming. And then homesteaders are providing commodities to cities. And so the modern system of railroads and transportation networks that you see crisscrossing the Great Plains and West, connecting to places like Chicago, Kansas City, and the like, these can be attributed to homesteaders and the Homestead Act as a net impact. And then finally, I'd like to highlight the fact that we've kind of alluded to at the start of this presentation with that introduction, which is that American society is suddenly finding itself through the Homestead Act re-relating to one another. And the language of the Homestead Act established a lot of precedent at a federal level that had not yet been enacted legislatively. If you read the Homestead Act's original text, there's no reference to race, and there's no reference to sex or gender. And what that means is that if you were a woman in American society in the 19th century, you could apply to be a homesteader if you were over the age of 21 or the head of household, and you could own property. That has a big downstream effect because it is a federal mandate that establishes property rights for women, where before that was a matter left up to states. And so it is homesteading states that offer the economic weight behind the women's suffrage movement that ultimately culminates in the 19th Amendment. And it's homesteading territories and states that offer universal suffrage prior to the 19th Amendment. And then we can think about the lack of language related to race under the Homestead Act, and that reveals and enables Black Americans and formerly enslaved folk to apply for homestead claims and find empowerment through access to property. And this is where I can geek out about all of this at any point in time. But this is going to be the focus of our talk today. Black homesteaders are a major part of the homesteading story. And yet, they do not often leave imprints on the landscape. So, put a pin in that for a second, because that ties back into my perspectives when I was viewing the homesteading story and thinking about how it shapes landscapes. I would like to, before we dive into the value of genealogical research in unpacking stories, to highlight a little bit why landscapes are useful ways of understanding United States history. And then we complicate them and bring them together. So as a historical geographer, I read a little bit of work by a guy named Pierce Lewis. He is a cultural geographer out of State College, Pennsylvania, and he is recently deceased. But he said this in one of his best known papers. which is the beholding eye. 10 versions of seeing the same scene. Or no, that's Don Meinig. This is Pierce Lewis, How to Read the American Scene. Landscapes are unwitting autobiography, and they reflect our tastes and our values and our ideas. All of our cultural warts and blemishes are there, and all of our glories too. But above all, our ordinary day-to-day qualities are there for anybody who wants to find them and who knows how to look for them. And so when I was asked to give a presentation here to a group of genealogists, I found that there was a lot of overlap between the lenses that geographers use to understand our past and who we are, that of landscape, and the tools that genealogists bring to bear on understanding their family histories. Because we're looking at everyday lives. So, as a geographer, what I take from this is the idea that you can look at any landscape and the things that people build on that landscape, and you can understand them. If you look at a gas station, you get some idea of what people are eating, what level of technology they have, maybe what a car culture looks like and everything that entails. You might be able to tell connections to different places because the resources that go into the production of a structure are coming from somewhere else. Any landscape begs a whole lot of questions, and if you read them like a book and you know the right questions to ask, you can begin to unpack a deeper understanding of the people producing them. We see that in all kinds of landscapes, the everyday lived ones, and the special landscapes of national parks or public lands. I'm sure we can all look at the Statue of Liberty and put meaning to that if we were to look at it. So cool. We've got an idea of a landscape and the built things that we put on that landscape. They tell us stories. And for many homesteading experiences, we can see those today. If you ever have a chance to come up to Beatrice, Nebraska, where Homestead National Historical Park is, you're going to pass a lot of windmills and a lot of windmills that no longer are connected to the water pumps that would bring water up from the water table down below. Every time you see one of those windmills, there's a homestead there at some point or another. Every time you find rhubarb where rhubarb wouldn't grow naturally, chances are that's somebody's homesteading garden. Little traces that can unpack pieces of the past and how people lived their lives. With Black homesteaders, though, and particularly the community that we'll talk about in just a moment, Audacious, you might see a scene that looks like this if you were to visit the site of Audacious today. That's a really hard landscape to read. And so this is where genealogical research comes into play and the role of social memory and exploring landscapes where people are no longer there and there's not much trace of what they have produced and left on that landscape because it's maybe fallen into disrepair or become silenced. Well, that's where we have to hit the archives and hit other sources. So I'm really excited to be asked to present to an audience that I think already understands that. Now, let's put on our historian hats for a second and think about Black homesteading experiences on a macro level. The Homestead Act of 1862 enables people to apply for up to 160 acres of land. And it is only in the aftermath of the Civil War that you begin to see Black homesteaders applying for homestead claims. And that's because in 1866, we end up seeing a subsequent act termed the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which opens up homesteading in a lot of the southern states that you see above me there, places like Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and the like. And the plan behind that related act, which had a lot of the same language of the original Homestead Act, was to enable formerly enslaved folk to file homestead claims on lands in the South. They're already located in the South, and so they have been recently emancipated with the end of the Civil War. And the idea was that to enable formerly enslaved folk to participate in US society, you need to connect them to an economic base of land tenure. The Southern Homestead Act has federal aid put in place to connect Black homesteaders to the homesteading process in Southern states. But in Reconstruction era politics, there are a lot of barriers to the full fruition of the intended goals of the Southern Homestead Act. And ultimately, many formerly enslaved folk decide to take advantage of the 1862 Act and file claims across the Great Plains and American West. And they do so in two primary models. The first model is that of independent homesteading, where if you were an applicant as a homesteader, you would go to a general land office, just like everyone else, and apply for a claim and see what was open, and you would go out and attempt to make a go of that claim and proving up. And independent Black homesteading experiences account for about a quarter of all Black homesteaders in a lot of the research that has been done to explore this topic. And so these are all rough numbers, but in the first 100 years of the Homestead Act or thereabouts, you find that there are about 1.6 million Americans filing homestead claims. And we don't have a comprehensive study of all 30 homesteading states, but we do have some recent studies that look at many homesteading states and lump them together. We've been able to identify about 26,000 Black homesteading claims, of which approximately a quarter are independent homesteaders. Now, when I talk about a homesteading claim, all we see is the head of household or the person over the age of 21 filing that claim. So you can fudge the numbers and extrapolate probably an extended number of actual homesteaders on the ground. Independent Black homesteaders, they have wildly divergent experiences in homesteading. To unpack these stories, you have to look at newspaper records, and you have to look at how newspapers in the 19th century and early 20th century are recognizing Black homesteaders in Great Plains states, because they are a minority and they are commented upon. And in the late 19th century, all the way into the 1920s and 30s, which is when you see some changes to technologies as a form of mass communication, you end up finding that there are a ton of newspapers to draw from as resources. And I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with exploring newspaper records. And if you look at them, at newspaper records across the plains, basically every town of any size has a newspaper and a local printing press. You find that they will comment on Black homesteaders in diverse ways as independent Black homesteaders. Many of them, especially in places like southeastern Nebraska, where there's a ton of newspapers communicating about independent Black homesteaders because they were filing claims in southeastern Nebraska, you find that there's a lot of positive press coverage. And southeastern Nebraska and eastern Nebraska, and the newspapers producing them very much say, hey, this is a place where racial lines are blurred. And so they highlight Black homesteading experiences and compare them to Southern Black homesteading experiences, which face structural racism in the Deep South. I'm going to ask a question here, and if you've got some brainstorming thoughts, enter them in the chat. Why might Great Plains states compare and contrast their opportunities for Black homesteaders compared to the American South? In what ways is that advantageous for communities to talk about and highlight opportunity in the Great Plains in the aftermath of the Civil War? Wendy hits one big aspect on it. It brings commerce to new states. Yeah, yep. It brings population to new states. Any other guesses? Well, I may have, oh, there we go. Yes, there we go. We're seeing population seeding effectively, right? Many homesteading states start as territories. And so one of the ways to promote place is to talk about it via publications. And newspapers aren't the only way that that's occurring. You're also seeing postcards circulating. You're seeing rail lines create bulletins that encourage people to come out and homestead, and they will target audiences. And so many rail companies trying to build railways across the United States and capitalize on the opportunity of selling tickets will send posters, promotional posters to the American South saying, come to a place like Kansas, come to a place like Nebraska. It's free land, and you'll find good company here, effectively. Those are called bulletins. And so that drew independent Black homesteaders. And many of them are held up as, in 19th century newspaper culture, as exemplary citizens in the communities in which they settle. And that is intended to showcase the friendliness of the community, as well as showcase the opportunity to bring people in and to show that the Homestead Act works, right? If you read a lot of historical records with a lens towards where our interests invested, you begin to draw new insights about how people conceive of themselves. Just like if you look at a landscape and see what values are embodied in the material culture that persists. The other model of homesteading for Black homesteaders, though, was termed a colony model. And I'll use the term colony today because that's what pops up in the historical literature that covers homesteading experiences and Black homesteading experiences. And basically, the colony model says this: a whole lot of Black homesteading families intending to homestead would go and file claims so that they are adjacent to one another. And they would move out to file these claims in groups. What are some advantages of that, or perceived advantages of coming together, filing claims as individual families, but traveling as a group of families together out to the homestead claims to try and make it go? Yeah, Suzanne suggests preserving cultural heritage. And yes, Black homesteaders have oftentimes a shared experience. What other ideas come to mind? Community support. That's terrific. Community support can take so many forms, from childcare to shared tasks on labor, to just knowing that your neighbor knows who you are. What else comes into play or comes to mind? Shared faith. Yeah, as we'll see, some of the community institutions that Black homesteaders find community within are churches. Maybe I can seed the ground here and say that many Black homesteaders are formerly enslaved folk. Yep, Christy nailed it, right? Security with others. They are fleeing the structural racism of the Reconstruction era South, right? There's a lot of disadvantages to being formerly enslaved in the American South during the Reconstruction period. And so to band together and head to an entirely new environment that you may not have encountered before provides a sense of security against uncertainty. And historical practices, yeah, there is a lumping together of financial resources as well in trying to make a claim work. And so the vast majority of Black homesteaders file claims in groups and together as colonies. And the map behind me here, the 6 Black homesteading map site, that is a collection of 6 colonies that we have identified across the Great Plains as part of a Center for Great Plains Studies collaborative project that happened here at Homestead pre-Rob. But it is from which I draw much of my research and presentation materials today. And those colonies are examples that we have found through research as to their presence across the Great Plains. And then the flag or the star that we see on that map underneath the town of DeWitty, that is a community of Black homesteaders that is eventually named Audacious. And that is where we get the title of our talk today. And that's where we'll explore Black homesteading experiences through reconstructing the past by way of research, thinking about social memory, and thinking about the silences of landscape and how we can pull them forward. This is a scene from approximately near where DeWitty was. And there's not a lot there if you view it as a geographer. So it's a challenge that I think the tools of genealogical research really reveal. So DeWitty, Nebraska, or Audacious, Nebraska, is a Black homesteading colony that emerges after one of the first big amendments, or the first big acts that is adjusting the terms of the Homestead Act and actually superimposing itself on there. And that is the Kincaid Act of 1904. So, you might be saying, why is this? Well, the Homestead Act of 1862 offers 160 acres of land for applicants. And that works really well in places like eastern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, Illinois, Iowa, where you get significant amounts of precipitation, especially in the summer months. We basically get a thunderstorm every day in the summer months here. There are well-watered big river systems crisscrossing these areas in sort of the eastern Great Plains. And there's really, really terrific soil offered by the tall grass prairie. Once you plow that under, you've got great soil for crops that are adapted to those environments. Yeah, Bill, I will get back into that one in just a second here, because that's a terrific question. One that might be above my pay grade as well in the ultimate finality of offering a firm response. But as homesteaders begin to fill in the eastern Great Plains, people seeking out the Homestead Act farther west are faced with different environmental conditions. Basically more aridity, And those of you who have read a lot of American West scholarship might think about Walter Prescott Webb's The Great Plains. It's a dated piece, but it does have a profound line of explaining the Great Plains and its settlement through reference to the 100th meridian. Basically saying if you are west of the 100th meridian, aridity is going to be something you need to deal with. And so for homesteaders, 160 acres isn't enough to successfully prove up in Western spaces. And the Kincaid Act in 1904 is one of the first federal acts that recognizes that 160 acres isn't enough in the sandhills of Nebraska. So it says you can apply for up to 640 acres. And what this means is that many homesteaders who have filed for 160 acres elsewhere can file the remainder in the sandhills of Nebraska, up to 480 additional acres. And the first wave of Black homesteaders who may have filed independently or may have filed in colonies begin to see the sandhills of Nebraska as a place where they can take hard-won experience of that first wave of homesteading and apply it towards gaining further land in the sandhills. And they're not alone in this. There's a lot of white homesteaders, there's a lot of immigrant homesteaders coming from elsewhere who are doing the same thing, right? But for Black homesteaders, they're deciding to move on a colony model. And then I'll take a moment here and respond to Bill's question, which is that many homesteading and land grant bills are introduced in Congress before the Civil War. They oftentimes did not pass because prior to the Civil War, there's a lot of debate and resistance on the part of both Northern industrialists and Southern plantation owners about enabling people to apply for land grants and become smallholder farmers. For Northern industrialists, it meant that a lot of the cheap labor of urban places would apply to become farmers elsewhere. So they lobbied against it. For Southern plantation owners, they saw smallholder farmers independent of a plantation system as being able to undercut the slave economy that was dominating the American South. And so they would lobby against it. Nonetheless, there are a few acts and sort of de facto practices that would have come into place that transferred federal lands into private hands, like preemption acts and so on. I would have to dig into deeper historical research to find that. And so when the Homestead Act is signed in the midst of the Civil War, there's a lot of federal land that needs to be distributed. But Abraham Lincoln does it strategically to dispose of that land in the federal domain, to make it productive. But it's also a way to keep the territories of the American West and Midwest, and a lot of states that are newly formed in the American West and Midwest, firmly within the realm of federal control, because it incentivizes those states to encourage homesteaders to come to those areas and settle them and become more socioeconomically stable. So great question, Bill. And for those of you in the class today, I'm happy to take this in whatever direction you'd like in terms of questions. So thanks for seeding the ground there. I really appreciate it. So where was I? Yes, Kincaid Act of 1904. Black homesteading colonies begin to pop up in the Sandhills. And DeWitty has its initial claimants filing probably sometime around 1902 to 1905. And I say probably because we know we have Black homesteaders arriving to take advantage of just the usual 1862 claim in the far western Sandhills. And there's already probably an awareness that there's going to be modifications of how many acres one could claim, because this is congressional legislation that's actively being debated. And then if you look at who files claims, there is reference to race in the paperwork that you would file. And so you have to reconstruct by names or by people's commentaries about who's filing claims or through kinship ties. And that's something we'll get into in a little bit. But we know that by about 1908, you find a spike in Black homesteaders arriving to the Sandhills of Nebraska and filing claims adjacent to one another in and around the community of DeWitt. And DeWitt is named in those early years by one of the early homesteaders, who is a Black homesteader, who does file a claim there, and then who also opens up the post office. So this graph here demonstrates kind of the estimated peak of DeWitty's population out in the Sandhills of Nebraska. And we can get back to that in just a moment there. But you see that it never really exceeds much more than 160 people, and estimates vary widely. And we have to piece it together via census data and social memory and newspaper records. And then, if we look at the spatial layout of claims, we see that this is really highlighting that homesteaders are filing claims together. All those squares in green, right, of various shapes, are claims filed by individual families, and these are all Black families or mixed race families. Now, if we look at the last names here, what can we draw from the claims above my head, or what conclusions can we draw? I'll stand out of the way here. We do see some spatial extent. We see a lot of male applicants. We also see a lot of family ties. So when we think about the establishment of Black homesteading colonies, these are very much forms of kinship migration or step migration or chain migration. All of those are terms that you may hear interchangeably, and they basically mean that at some point or another, you're seeing family groups communicating with one another and coordinating migration efforts. And yeah, you see a lot of brothers and cousins, or fathers and sons, or parents and daughters filing claims next to one another. That is a good insight that is brought to the fore, which is, yeah, for many formerly enslaved folk, you would find naming practices that would be Euro-American, oftentimes linked to communities and previous slave owner surnames, or linked to trades, or linked to status, right? As a side note, here at Homestead National Historical Park, we're located where we are because it is the claim of a Daniel Freeman. And one of the questions that we get, and he's the first homesteader to file a claim, arguably, in the country. And a lot of questions we get are, was Daniel Freeman a formerly enslaved man? And he wasn't, but he may have some descendants. So or he may be descended from formerly enslaved folk at some point or another. So yeah, we find here that we're seeing kinship ties all come together. We're seeing, that lots of families are, of course, coming from formerly enslaved backgrounds. One thing, yeah, Suzanne, that's a great question. are there race records on homestead claims paperwork? There aren't. And so whenever we are determining uh, whether or not someone was a Black homesteader, we are doing so through cross-referencing census records with homestead patents and homestead filing. And then there's another method of figuring things out, which is to, when you receive your patent, that is, receive the title of land after you've successfully proved up, you cross-reference the names of the witnesses and see who has witnessed you proving up on the land. And oftentimes you do that with census records. And in Black homesteading colonies in particular, you find that the most respected members of the community would be the ones who would serve as witnesses, and you'd be able to identify them because as the most respected members of the community, they were often commented on not only in letters and written records produced by the community, but also of neighboring white majority communities in and around places like Audacious or DeWitt. And yeah, Wendy points out a very pragmatic aspect of homesteading and spatial layout here. And that is they're by rivers. The sandhills are exceptionally dry if you've ever headed out there. And they are actually shifting sand dunes of prairie that largely reuse grazeland still are today. And then, yeah, Suzanne raises a great point. When you think about who are the witnesses, oftentimes it would be justices of the peace, pastors, perhaps school teachers and the like who are in the area. And so I would love now to explore a little bit of what the community of DeWitty looks like at its peak and what the community members look like in terms of their lifeways. Because we'll find that Black homesteaders, in this story that plays out in DeWitty, plays out in other homesteading colonies as well, both fit the pattern of wider homesteading experiences in their day-to-day lives, but also end up having different points of emphasis and community ties that then produce different outcomes in the long term that help explain why these communities end up disappearing. So the colony of DeWitty is established, and through kinship ties, through letter writing, through successful proving up, through intermarriage, we begin to find a flourishing rural community. There is no single town. Rather, there are many homesteads that are more or less connected by geographical distance to one another. And then there are focal points that are built where community members would congregate. One of them is the post office. The post office is initially run out of the back house of, his first name escapes me, but DeWitty is his last name. And eventually it is recognized as incorporated as a community, and you get a federal post office. And this is critically important because a post office puts you on the map. And letter writing culture of the late 19th century and 20th century, well, they really, really, really connect people to one another. And there's a documented pattern of Black homesteaders communicating between colonies with one another. And so you find connections across great distances. If we look back, for example, at our homesteading sites map here, all of those communities, with the exception of Blackdom in New Mexico, are sending family members to and from DeWitty, and there are strong correspondence ties between them. And sometimes they're filing claims elsewhere. Sometimes it's sons and daughters intermarrying. And sometimes you find people selling their claims and trying to prove up in another location because of a variety of reasons, right? And so recognize that we see a lot of interconnection. We also find interconnection via postal records to international locations, because many formerly enslaved folk in the United States find a new home in Canada. And then when the Homestead Act begins to become an established method of finding socioeconomic prosperity, immigrate once again to the United States. So part of that in the research that we have is through unclaimed letters. Much more of it is through personal collections. As a part of the research project that took place in around, between 2017 and 2019, we found that a lot of the cross-reference census data enabled with homestead claims and patents enabled the researchers to identify then descendants via census records and then directly contact them. And you find a lot of letter collections that way. And then they began oral histories as well with those descendants, which is how we begin to piece together this story much more effectively. So the post office, that is one locus of community. And indeed, the postmaster was oftentimes highly educated and would be one of those figures of note in the community who is oftentimes a point of contact to other communities. What other community institutions do you think might really matter to binding together the homesteading community of DeWitt? Intermarriage between colonies, and then Wendy's got it, schools. DeWitt School, and this is a scene of a class at peak enrollment, is a fascinating example of the one-room schoolhouse system, which homesteaders in general put a lot of value into, and Black homesteading colonies in particular emphasized heavily. So to understand those points of overlap and individuality and differences, we have to understand the public one-room schoolhouse a little bit more in depth. One-room schoolhouses were cropping up across homesteading communities across the United States. They were also in non-homesteading states, and these were viewed as civic institutions where the community paid taxes to support those institutions. They invested heavily in those institutions to educate children of the community. Cool. That sounds about like a pattern that plays out time and time again across the US. And the material culture of that is fascinating. We have a historic schoolhouse on site here in Nebraska, but the cultural implications are also really fascinating. For many homesteaders who were already American citizens, schools are viewed as civic institutions where you can reconnect to American national identity, even in the quote-unquote frontier of the Great Plains and West. For homesteaders who intended to become citizens, schools are sites where you gain the language through which you can become an American citizen. And then for Black homesteaders, many of whom are formerly enslaved, schools represent an opportunity for you and your children to gain an education in ways that had not been available to you as an enslaved person. And so for Black homesteading communities, they invested heavily in schools. They shopped around for teachers were oftentimes initially ministers. They may have been black, they may have been white. Increasingly, and in DeWitty's case, black school teachers taught in the school. And these were viewed as critical institutions through which one could ensure that the economic prosperity of the land be transferred to your children. What do we notice about this historical photograph here about the students in the school? And the teacher is there in the front holding a stick there. Get out of the way. All ages. Yeah, this was a K-8 school, but all ages would be incorporated because education would run pretty much continuously year round, but you might have to drop out as an individual to perform labor on farms. So your education might be extended. Yep, you find that there are many women older trying to learn and engaging in education spaces. That's critically important when you think about the intersections of labor and gender across the American Midwest and West. For many homesteading women who might not be a head of household, you could find economic prosperity through acquiring an education and leveraging that in some other career path. So that's terrific too. Any other thoughts about the image, about the material culture that they have? Suzanne took the words right out of my mouth. There is a clear demonstration that people are wearing their Sunday best. And I think that suggests if we read that photograph with an eye towards the values that people hold in the material cultures that they produce. You wear your Sunday best because that's an institution and that's a moment that's important to you. So, historical records and increasingly towards the tail end of the period of DeWitty's success and persistence as a community indicate that the school started as an independent public school dominated by the direct descendants of formerly enslaved folk, and that it was a Black majority school. And it remained a Black majority school, but there were white neighbors who oftentimes sent their students to this school because it became pretty renowned as a site of a quality K-8 education. And to situate ourselves back in the early 20th century, an 8th grade education was one that, if done well, could prepare you for entry into university and college systems. The high school system, the K-12 educational system that we find and that we might think of today, that is beginning to pick up steam at the turn of the 20th century, but in remote places like DeWitty, it is not necessarily the model that is universally accessible. And so to invest heavily in a K-8 education meant that reading, writing, arithmetic, sometimes a language, a foreign language, and then sometimes heavy doses of civic education would be provided, and that would be enough for you to take entrance exams to get into universities elsewhere. And so many DeWitty school children end up graduating in 8th grade and then pursuing higher education elsewhere. They might pursue school In places like St. Louis, we have records of that. In Kansas City, we have records of that. And receive degrees related to becoming a pastor, degrees related to becoming a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer. And then, because of those strong kinship ties that exist not only between DeWitty and the direct connection of the student going out to receive their schooling elsewhere, but also with other homesteading colonies across the plains, you see a lot of boomerang effects during those years of the community being in place. And you find that children return to pursue work in the community from which they left. And yeah, Suzanne's zooming in, if you will, to some of the material culture produced and used in schoolhouses. I can't zoom in far enough, but I'm willing to guess that that textbook is an example. That's an example of a textbook, and that it probably would be something related to, say the equivalent of a reader or a relatively standardized learning text. We have an example here for students to pursue. So there are many readers and guides that were circulating and being published. I am aware of McGuffey's as being kind of a gold standard. And you'll note, if anyone's familiar with university presses, that John Wiley and Sons is a major university press for academic journal articles. They're producing educational materials basically from the late 1800s on into the opening decades of the 20th century. So let's see. I can geek out about schools all day as well, too. But we've looked at the post office. We've looked at schools. What other community centers might communities heavily invest in? And a community like DeWitty heavily invest in. A general store. There was a general store. I pull up a picture of that general store. Let's see. I do not have a picture of the general store, but there was one, and there are photographs of it. Yeah. A general store was established pretty early, and then churches. That's what I was looking for. And there's the church. And this is the congregation. This was an Episcopalian church. And the two gentlemen you see at the front of that image, they were the leaders of that church community. They were also highly educated individuals. That is Moses Speece and another member of the Speece family whose name is escaping me right now. They are kin, and they are both relatives from previously homesteading elsewhere, right? And then filling out the remaining acreage in the Sandhills. And churches are places where you find incredible community cohesion form. And earlier, one of you mentioned that cultural heritage was one reason why many Black homesteaders might live in a colony together. And one of you mentioned religious life. Yeah, religious life was central to a lot of Black homesteading communities, and this one was dominated by the St. James Episcopalian Church. And they really are in their Sunday best. Another thing I would like to highlight here is that we see some mixed race families. In particular, we see members of the Meehan family. And this ties into our discussion of independent homesteading experiences. The Meehan family, or Meehan, if I mispronounced that, I'm sorry, is one that was formed from an intermarriage of independent Black homesteading children in central Nebraska who were filing under the 1862 Act. Their parents are formerly enslaved, and filing under that act. They proved up successfully, and the daughters end up marrying into another homesteading family, who then decide to take advantage of the Kincaid Act and move out to DeWitt, where they already have ties with other communities. And so what this suggests about Black homesteading experiences in much of the Great Plains as independent Black homesteaders is that the advertisements saying come out here for free land to avoid sort of the Reconstruction era politics of the South, well, there's some truth to it. Even as communities are lauding these things, there seems to be intermarriage occurring, right? Which I think suggests something about communities where intermarriage is occurring. And then where people move to also suggests something about the receiving communities, right? And their attitudes towards race and their attitudes towards how races interact with one another in this time where we know that racial tensions may exist elsewhere. DeWitt is never necessarily facing racism from local communities that are white majority around them. We have evidence of that. Newspapers produced, DeWitt was never large enough to produce its own newspaper, but other communities like Ballantyne, Nebraska, which I believe is the county seat today in western Nebraska in Cherry County, where DeWitt was located. And then I think it's Brownlee is the name of the neighboring community where DeWitt had most of its economic transactions. Those two communities had newspapers. They would remark on the comings and goings of DeWitt residents. That was a really common practice in newspapers to just say, oh, so-and-so came into town today. And for the most part, DeWitt residents are also publishing comings and goings in those papers, suggesting a pretty amicable relationship between white majority communities and Black majority communities in the Plains. I don't know where church records preserved. Suzanne, I don't know that off the top of my head. One of the things that I can do is look to see what's been cited in our research and consolidation and get back to you on that. And I'll make a note of that now. For DeWitt, and this is just a 10,000-foot guess, knowing that the community eventually declines in population, but people are moving elsewhere, I'm guessing that they're taking the records with them. That is just speculation based on investigating where or whether or not these records are preserved and then where they might be. So let's see. We've looked at church, looked at school, looked at the post office. Earlier, someone suggested that farming practices are a shared labor activity. And indeed, they are. We think of homesteading, or so often homesteading is framed as a popular mythology of homesteading. Reflects on homesteaders as individualistic, as being able to find success as individuals. That was a popular image that is lauded upon throughout much of the earlier half of the 20th century. I mentioned Walter Prescott Webb earlier as an author. He highlights individualism as a value. He was publishing in the 1930s about the United States expansion into the West. The reality is homesteaders who worked together proved up at higher rates. And shared farming practices were a common tie that bound together residents whether you were black or white, you all came together at harvest time and worked together to ensure that harvest could be brought in at the time of fashion and to ensure that your neighbors would be able to help each other out during those processes. This is a scene here of haying. Haying occurs across the sandhills because that was one thing that a lot of that acreage could produce relatively easily. And it ensured that your grazing animals, if you had them, which many black homesteaders did in the sandhills, could survive potentially brutal winters. And so haying was a time when everyone was brought together, and that would be a time of celebration. And that's something where you also found itinerant labor occurring, where homesteaders would hire themselves out to other homesteaders, and you'd find a flow of cash within that time. Did they stagger the planting per homestead? I am not aware of that. That is a good idea, but you might need to plant a large number of crops or have a really great growing season. And laying fallow is important. And oftentimes the claims are big enough and your capacity to conduct labor is pushed to the limit at a 480 acre claim that you might lay fallow some acreage one year and plant another set of acreage within your claim and attempt to make a go of it. In the sandhills, aridity is a factor. We have records that these homesteaders were producing corn, wheat, barleys, and rye. And all of that makes sense. They can be brought in. Winter wheat in particular was a popular one. And then most homesteading households would have small gardens. And that's where a lot of micro exchanges would occur between community members, because that's where you could plant a wide variety of crops and water them and ensure that they come to fruition. One of the big ones in homesteading communities across the Great Plains is that of melons and other water-intensive fruits, because they could store pretty well. They were really sweet. They fetched a high price at market. And then symbolically, if you could bring in a watermelon crop or a melon crop, you would find that you had had it made, because at that point you had enough water and you had enough time to ensure those things could be taken care of and not eaten by bugs before you could harvest them. And so if we look at historic photographs of a lot of homesteading communities, black or white across the Great Plains, you find that a lot of the times families would trot out a kitchen table and put a watermelon on, and they'd be in their Sunday best. We'll see a lot of Sunday best imagery because photography is widely available, but it is still unusual during this period. And so I'd love to show you a typical DeWitty homestead, and we can analyze it for what life might look like on that homestead during a peak period. And so I apologize that I do not remember off the top of my head the homesteading family to which this photograph belongs, right? It is now in the Nebraska State Archives. But let's think about the photograph as clues to cultural values and livelihoods. What do we see here? Mud bricks is a great guess. That is a sod house. The Sandhills, if you've never been, is a long, shifting grassland. And so wood would be high priority, and you'd build a soddy. That was another task where community members would come together. It was also a cash economy. DeWitty homesteaders would sometimes, if they heard that somebody had filed a claim, black or white, in the neighboring area, they would go out and hire themselves out as laborers and build a sod house for cash. Yeah. Yeah, you got the family dog there, right? Sitting in the chair. and he looks pretty darn happy to be there. He or she, yeah. And then we see all of the possessions have been brought outside. Yeah, a lot of those would be carted back in at the end of this photograph session. Anything else? Yeah, it looks like we have two sides of one family, or at least a couple of generations, right? Husband and wife and husband and wife. Yeah. Um, and indeed, we have two households. And not knowing the specifics of this particular homestead picture, and again, that's on me for forgetting the label, I'd like to pop over to the map for a second and look at claims. That might very well be two homestead claims adjacent to one another that decided to build their houses next to one another. Because we see two households. It's a possibility that those are two families directly adjacent to one another. And the reason why I highlight that as a possibility is we know that that is a common tactic that homesteaders would take in filing claims and building land on the claims. You wouldn't build your homestead way out in the middle of nowhere. You'd build it next to neighbors, and you might build it next to kin. And the final thing I'd like to highlight, yeah, looks like we've got potential for marriage groups and unmarried children and the like. Yeah. I'd love to highlight here the horses and buggy in the back. That might be a workaday buggy. We don't have enough, or a workaday wagon. We don't have enough information in its full articulation. But a common practice amongst homesteaders who had it made would be to invest in a buggy in addition to a work wagon. And so many images you might find would include that as well. This is another homesteading household. And it is that of one of the pastors in the church, right? So we can begin to see, and I believe this is Charles Spees behind me. We can begin to see differences in the quality of construction of a house. And this is a very finely made sod house. Let me hop back to that previous picture there. All right, so yes, Suzanne points out a smokestack in the back. A range or a stove would be a central gathering point in any sod house. And oftentimes it'd be made of cast iron and rather fixed. And that would be a central heating point. Oftentimes, especially in the humid plains, or the arid plains where you have temperature extremes, you would find that there'd be a summer kitchen as well in the back with an additional range. That was a common practice. And you're right. There doesn't appear to be a smokestack in the other one. We can't explain it necessarily with the information we have here. Could be a shared kitchen. That is an astute point. We can speculate that there might be a shared kitchen between those two households. I didn't think of that. Awesome, thank you. So, just wanted to highlight this house because, sorry to bring it back to geography, but I can geek out about folk architecture. And this is a really fine example of a sod house. And today in Nebraska, that pyramid roof, which was a way of minimizing the use of wood in your roof construction, would have been roofed with sod, but then because that pyramid four-square structure was so popular as a sod house construction, you'll still hear people in Nebraska call that a sod roof. If they see it in a modern construction with shingles. Oh, that's a sod pyramid. Yeah. I'm impressed with the large windows too. And pragmatically, those serve a really important point to being able to be opened up and let air flow through. And they are of means. That's the husband and wife community leaders of that Episcopalian church. I would like now to highlight one additional institution that suggests those relationships between communities, both Black homesteading colonies and white homesteading colonies, or white homesteading communities, excuse me, that I was surprised to learn about, and I think speaks to the reality of relatively good relationships between DeWitty, or Audacious, and I'll put an asterisk in that and get back to it, and the nearby community of Brownville, and that is the community baseball team. DeWitty, and I think this speaks to the vitality of the community, DeWitty was flourishing at around 100 so people to 160 people. And at that time, they had all successfully proved up in that area. They had all begun to find economic prosperity. Their schools are up and running. Their churches are loci of community ties. And, oh, there's enough people to establish a baseball team. And that team would travel around the area, face off with other community teams. And so they travel as far as Valentine, Nebraska, which is over 40 miles away from DeWitty. And in the early 1900s, that's a haul. And so it would be an overnight trip a lot of the time. And while there, you'd have a festival of sorts, and you have multiple games playing in a tournament, and then everybody would go back home. These were things that are commented on in papers. They're also things that are remembered, because all of us can probably remember a big community event and think about, its significance for our lives and what it represents. And so when we have social memory come into play in the reconstruction of these communities, these are events that get remembered and talked about fondly, right? And they speak to a number of interlocking ideas that I think are of relevance to those of you exploring your genealogical histories, which is that social memory is a great way of tapping into the past. It's also a great way of finding maybe a nostalgic past. So then you've got to cross-reference that with other types of documentation to ensure that social memory and the past are coming together in really interesting ways. And so at its peak, DeWitty, yeah, fielded a baseball team. And it was a popular part of the community that was very much extending outward into other communities. So let's think about this. If you end up going to DeWitty today, were they sponsored? I'm guessing the community would have sponsored them to cover the costs of uniforms and the like. And that was probably a donation-based system. The articles that I've read comment on the baseball team, but they don't necessarily allude to much beyond referencing it as a significant planning institution. Bake sales at the church would certainly be a possibility, right? or bake sales at community centers and the like. Yeah. And so we'd like to shift towards population because at this point, we've been thinking about the ties that bind a community together and the ties that make it vital. And by vital, lively and supporting one another. We've seen photographic evidence of success. We've seen photographic evidence of shared labor. We have seen community institutions with high enrollments, especially relative to the population, right? So if we look at the population of DeWitt, why do you think we begin to see a decline? Why not stay on the land forever, like many homesteaders do? And in fact, there's relatively few Black homesteaders around the Great Plains who still hold on to the land, or descendants of Black homesteaders who still hold on to the land that their ancestors homesteaded. What factors might play into that? Suzanne hits a big one. Those educations that are gained in schools, well, they enable work opportunities elsewhere. Yeah. Any other guesses? Crop prices. Bingo. Oh, Christy, if I could geek out a moment on this. Suddenly, we find that crop prices matter, of course, right? Yes, they do. But this is suddenly tying DeWitty's story into not only regional histories, but international ones. Right around the 20s and 30s, you find the Soviet Union is forming and exporting grain on a massive scale, even as within the Soviet Union, there's a lot of chaos going on, right? But the glut of grain that is reaching the market tanks prices. So suddenly DeWitty's story is part of a much larger global history. Dust Bowl and stock market flux and changes to technologies. All of those things suggest this. In stock market crashes, you find, oh, suddenly, yeah, there's a lot of economic desperation. Communities hollow out. The Dust Bowl does impact the sandhills of Nebraska, and that does devastate ecologically a lot of opportunities for farming. And changes in farming practices suggest that, yeah, you might have to find work elsewhere because there's fewer farmers needed to farm the same amount of acreage. And that's certainly occurring in the time when DeWitty is operational. The 19-teens and 1920s are when you begin to see the arrival of massive changes to agriculture in that the prices drop for mechanized agriculture. Things like tractors and, automated machines. Their prices become accessible to those who have successfully homesteaded. Yeah, terrific. Younger generations looking for a different lifestyle, especially younger generations looking for ways to capitalize on the educations that they've received. And so all of those factors, a constellation of things, are coming together, and the population of DeWitty is in decline. And yet, the land is suddenly being transferred elsewhere too, in terms of its ownership. People are selling out, and they're using that sale of land to fund the lives of themselves and of their descendants in other contexts. And so when we begin to look at the descendants of Black homesteaders from DeWitty, very few of them have any direct tie, though some have memories of their grandparents or their parents having experienced those things. But many of them are pretty well aware that it is that 1, 2, 3 combination of community, education, and of land acquisition and sale that enable them in the present to have found the paths along which their lives are shaped today. And so there's a generational wealth that is emergent from the Black homesteading colonies of the Great Plains, even as many of them are disappeared. I will love to open this up for some questions for a little bit here, where I'd love to showcase the markers on the landscape that are now legible thanks to using a wide variety of archival records of cross-referencing patent data with census records, going out and finding descendants of homesteaders, interviewing them, and the like. And that is that in 2015, the Nebraska Historical Society successfully gathered through a lot of research enough to find a historical marker and to produce the text of a historical marker for the approximate location of DeWitt. I believe it's on highway. Oh, I won't botch the highway by misnaming it. But that historical highway marker dedication in 2015 was attended by the descendants of DeWitt, Nebraska, and many of them found and contributed to that project. And so genealogical research, right, conducted not only by experts, but also by people who are pursuing their own hobbies, are finding connections in the scope of this wider project. And then they are feeding into one another and contributing to the production of knowledge. So the work that genealogists do, critically important, both in the private sphere and the public sphere and in the quasi-public as well. Yeah, Suzanne asked a terrific question. Did they have a cemetery and was it preserved? As a geographer, I spent a lot of time wandering around cemeteries because they tell us a lot of things about the people who live there and their values and who they are connected to. There is a cemetery in and around where DeWitt was located. It is preserved. I believe it's on private land now. If I recall correctly, there are fewer than 20 interments there. And so with that, earlier when I was listening to Suzanne give her introduction in class notes, I suspect that I am preaching to the choir when I bring up these resources for genealogical research, and I'm a newcomer to genealogy. If I were to contribute to your newsletter and group, I would say that I'm a novice. In the scope of conducting other types of research and historical research and landscape analyses, where stories might be silenced by a lack of the landscape itself, or lack of presence in the landscape, I turn to sources like these. And so these are also, of course, viable sources for reconstructing genealogical research. Thank you. It is on Highway 83 in Nebraska. That's a state highway. Beautiful drive. The sand hills are very scenic because they lack a lot of clear markers on the landscape. And so for those of you who may work remotely, I'd love to highlight the fact that state historical societies are increasingly digitizing their records. Probably something you're all aware of at this point. And then cemeteries, if you can't visit a cemetery, you can oftentimes search cemetery records on findagrave.com. Just a really great resource that I've used that you probably already know about. And you can see whether or not someone's taken a photograph of any particular gravesite. Unfortunately, I can't pull it up today on this computer because I found that it is one of those websites that federal government computers don't really like to mess with. So, and then in terms of federal records databases, it sounds as though from your introductory class notes today that you are very familiar with a wide variety of federal sources. If you are interested in exploring homestead claims in particular, there are two sort of 1-2 punches that you can do to access homestead claims and investigate them as genealogical research materials. One is you can access the Federal Records database of the General Land Office, which is now housed within the Bureau of Land Management. Bureau of Land Management will allow you to access the patent if someone proved up successfully, and then also the plat data. That's basically the title and deed, right? But then the digitization projects for that are ongoing. And it becomes really, really useful when you can then look up case files through Ancestry.com. I don't have a subscription to that myself. Many libraries will have a free subscription to Ancestry.com. I imagine many of you are already deeply familiar with those sources. But in the proving up process, you had to file some paperwork with the GLO. And in proving up, you would end up receiving a case file, right? A lot of these are uploaded to Ancestry, and they tell you who the person was, who are their witnesses. Sometimes their children are listed or their next of kin. And then you can see how they improved the land, what their house looked like, and so on. And that's a really great resource for feeding into other stories down the line. And then many of you have probably explored county historical societies and historical museums. I've done so in the context of other research. One thing that I can recommend for that is that their websites may not always be up to date, but their Facebook page might be better up to date. So check that out, and always call ahead if you're planning a research trip, because many of these organizations are hard strapped for staff. And so they may only be open a couple days a week. And calling ahead will ensure that you can connect to those resources. Behind me here now are just a couple of sources that I consulted when I began formulating a version of this particular presentation. I will leave that up. You can access it. They are all peer-reviewed scholarship that can be available through various forms of Google Scholar. And if you have access to university database systems, it seems to me that you may have some level of access to the community college library databases, you might be able to pull those up and take a look at sort of the lenses through which I am viewing the particular story that we have discussed here today. And I'd also like to throw a thanks to one of my colleagues who has taught me a lot about the system you see here. You've seen some graphs that's taught and so on. And then I'd like to kind of lead us back to the so what, and that is this. At the very beginning of today's talk, Suzanne mentioned that I find that public lands education and outreach is a really flexible way of connecting to people and teaching a wider scope of American history that you might not otherwise get in a K-12 classroom, or if you're unlucky enough to not stumble upon it. I guess my waving my arm is a stumble upon it. Maybe you never drive past the DeWitte Historical Highway marker and don't know that that history has occurred there. But one of the beauties of public lands education, and one of the beauties of genealogical research, is that you can find moments where silences are now made legible and readable. And I think that's really, really powerful for better understanding our own lives in the present. And I'd like to end with two brief quotations from a poet, T.S. Eliot, who comes to mind whenever I think about these things as an interpreter, as an educator, as someone interested in the past, interested in the ways that people lived in the past, which I suspect is a shared enthusiasm. This is from T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding. And on the value of connecting to past people, I come back time and time again to this. We die with the dying, and you see they depart, and we go with them. And we are born with the dead. See, they return and bring us with them. The moment in the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration, and a people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments. I like to think about that when I think about the work of genealogists, because we're finding the moments that resonate with us in the present time now. And then when I think about the value of parks work, national parks, places like Homestead National Historical Park, they're really special. And we always think about them as like America's best idea, things like that, Wallace Stegner. But I think, and they are special in their own unique ways. I think the great value of them is you can come to them, where you can chat with rangers about the national stories that they tell, and you can take that knowledge and see your own home places in new light when you are far beyond the boundaries of the park. And T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding comes to mind again with that, when he writes that we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. That's why I think public lands research is so important, and outreach and education. And that's also why I think reconstructing past genealogy is so important, because you see places differently. You see the grave marker differently. You see the silence in the sandhills differently, because you know the people that live there. So thank you. I would love to open this up for questions, and really appreciated chatting with such a great, engaged audience here.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. And I'll open the mic up to the class. If you have a question, please turn on your mic, but leave off your camera because we are recording. I kind of wanted to clarify something. When you said independent Black homesteader, did you mean like not living next to other Black homesteaders?
That's correct. Yeah. Apologies for the miscommunication there. They are homesteading and filing claims without any plans to connect with a colony at the time of filing the claim. Many of them end up joining a colony down the line for kinship ties, for all of the reasons that we discussed earlier.
And Bill just put a question in the chat box for you.
Yeah. I am unsure of how numerous the local federal land offices were at the time. 1 or 2 per state, or much more numerous. So I guess the short answer is it depends. And there were typically multiple per state, and they would be in operation for a period of time. And then when it became less and less viable for that particular land office to best serve the local community, they might shut down. And I can only speak in generalities on that, but I know, for example, that, let me pull up a little bit of notes here. So in Ohio, for example, Ohio is a homestead state, but it had largely already been settled prior to the Homestead Act. The general land offices there would open and close in like a 10 or 20 year period, right, as local claims were sort of exhausted. And they did serve very large regional audiences as well. The first homestead claim filed under the Homestead Act, allegedly Daniel Freeman's claim, which was filed shortly after midnight on January 1st, 1863. That is in a town outside of Beatrice, Nebraska. I live 4 miles, or Homestead is situated 4 miles outside of Beatrice. He was filing with the Brownville office, which is located on the Missouri River. So quite some distance away, and then coming out here to do it. So they'd serve regional audiences. Great question, Bill.
Now, my grandmother, actually not my grandmother, my great-grandmother had 12 children, and she was on a farm in North Dakota. And I've often wondered, were the 12 children, part of the necessity of running a farm? So I guess my question to you is, like, were there large families associated with these Black homesteaders' necessity of being able to operate and run the farm?
Yeah, and that would have been a common pattern across homesteading communities in the American West and North America more broadly, basically all the way into the 1930s, right? Rural labor is hand intensive, if you will, even after mechanization begins, because you need a lot of people to engage in agricultural processes and to run households. So one impact of the Homestead Act is you see population booms across the United States. And in part, that is because really broadly and dependent on the particular historical technologies available, more children occur in rural spaces as opposed to urban spaces, right? And that pattern in the United States picks up and starts to pick up, or starts to get more blurred as the 20th century goes on. And then you see birth rates drop because of changing lifestyles.
Now, I do have another question while I'm waiting for the class to open up their mics and give a question. Do you own these photographs, or were they loaned to you by the families?
These photographs, many of which are now located in, we have rights to them, but then there's also, I'm sure, personal collections. A lot of them are now actually housed in the Nebraska State Historical Society archives and History Nebraska. And so when this research was being compiled, well before my time here, there was a lot of collaboration between Homestead National Historical Park families, researchers who are housed within the Center for Great Plains Studies and elsewhere, right? And so there's a lot of little pots where you can find photography, and apologies for not being more specific on that particular answer.
Okay, class, any other questions that you have?
Yeah, hi Sue, this is Wendy. So great presentation. I got some great notes. My family is from Pender, Nebraska, as well as Phillipsburg, Kansas, in that area. And and I actually got to take my daughter on a college tour that we went through, Nebraska, Kansas, a bunch of states, and we got to come to your museum there, and it's fabulous. It's absolutely fabulous. And it was so enjoyable seeing the buildings and just kind of the prairie. I mean, that picture almost looks like out your back door from the museum, and the presentation was about homesteading and how there was a gentleman that came in and spoke about homesteading, all the different acts people. But my question is, so when my family homesteaded in the Phillipsburg area, my grandpa, who was born in 1902, would tell me stories about Nicodemus, not much, but he would reference Nicodemus. And as a little girl, I thought it was interesting. So to hear your presentation is very interesting. The part that I always thought my grandpa said that a husband and wife could get 320 acres, So tell me a little bit more about the Kincaid Act, because was that only in the Sandhills, or was that everywhere else? So like in the late 1880s, 1890s, when my family was homesteading in Kansas.
Yeah, so I'll speak in generalities, and I'll defer you to the books to confirm all my names and dates.
Okay.
I don't have a head for them. But really broadly, there's a couple of ways that could have occurred. If you're filing under the Homestead Act of 1862, you'd be tapped out at 160 acres as an individual.
Okay.
Now, a husband and wife might not be husband and wife at the time that each of them filed for homestead claims. And so there's a potential that, say, and I'll use hypotheticals here. Let's say I am an unmarried man, but I have a partner who I intend to marry. I go out, I file 160 acres under the Homestead Act. My partner comes out as a single woman over the age of 21. she files 160 acres adjacent to mine.
Mhm.
We prove up independently of one another. We then marry, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Common practice in the 1862 Act. But then there are other acts. You mentioned the Kincaid Act, for example. Kincaid Act, I believe, was only for portions of the Sandhills. Kincaid was the name of a Nebraska senator or House of Reps member who was advocating for that act.
Yeah.
But then you find other acts that model themselves and follow that model of expanded acreage. The Desert Land Act, I forget what year that is, but that really kicks off to start settling places like Nevada or Wyoming. That's up to 640 acres. I think it could be more. The Timber Culture Act, that was a derivative act of the Homestead Act that really broadly said, hey, plant some trees, and that counts as you're improving the land. And that was bound into scientific notions of rain following the plow and rain following tree planting, which doesn't quite work out in a lot of the American West, right? And so there's lots of different acts where different amounts of acreage could be cultivated.
Okay. Yeah, because that we do have some of those timber culture acts too that I see from our family. So then that's the other thing. The other question is here in DeWitt here, this area, there's no trees. I mean, but because of the Dust Bowl and all that, I know my grandparents, they did over 100 miles of terracing work on all their farms. And so people were putting up windbreaks. They were putting up, all types of, laying the land out so the water would drain just correctly. So I have to look back at my grandparents and all the work that they did in the, since the early 40s when they first got their lands that they had bought. Because a lot of people lost their lands, and my grandpa was a druggist, and that's a drugstore owner, and they'd come in and the sheriff would sell a lot of land to my grandpa. He would offer it up to sell. But it just shows my grandparents' love for their country and their state and their home where they would do all that terracing. Plus, it did help with the government help paying for that terracing. But it sounds like from the graphs that you had in there, most everybody was leaving right around the Dust Bowl. So maybe they didn't have the time or the effort to do it. So.
Yeah, and earlier in the introduction of the day, I was so pleased to hear a discussion of the value of the CCC and WPA era institutions in terms of understanding the past, because they transform the Great Plains and park systems in really profound ways that we oftentimes take for granted. Tree breaks, which if you're ever driving around the Midwest and you see a small square of trees, either homesteaders planted that or the CCC, right? And there's terracing. There are lakes literally hewn out of the earth, right? By the CCC and so on. So yeah, terrific intersections here.
Yeah, but if I know I've told the class before, if they can get out to the museum that they should, and you guys have that house there. I just can't believe how many people lived in that house, how many 12 people lived in that house. And literally it's like by 16 by 16 and maybe a floor that you could climb up on a ladder, if I can't remember right, because you couldn't really get in there too much. But I mean, it's tiny. I talked about go out and play on the yard, concept, I'm sure was very prevalent then, but
yeah,
small.
Well, thank you for the plug for Homestead. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Tree planting. I have to geek out about tree planting for just a minute. Lots and lots of homesteaders would plant orchards. In fact, here at Homestead National Historical Park, Daniel Freeman planted orchards. None of those trees persist today, right? Surprisingly, DeWitt has some limited orchards too. But the thing is, a lot of these trees don't survive once you stop watering them, and they get chopped down. But then an interesting side note in understanding wider contexts is that there is a large process of reconstruction and exploring around the United States heritage cultivars that date to the homestead period. Because with modern agriculture, we have relatively few cultivars of fruits. Historically, homesteaders are planting many, many, many more. And so if those trees are surviving, there's ongoing projects to document those things around the United States. I'm no longer aware of the status of those projects, but I'm aware of several universities that are participating at various points in time in reconstructing and collecting repositories of cultivars related to homesteading orchards. And then we've got a great question about Native Americans and homestead. So I'm going to speak in really broad generalities here because this is not an area that I've read up in great depth on. Native Americans were excluded from the first Homestead Act of 1862, and they're excluded from many other homestead-derived acts. I'm aware of a historical study that examined South Dakota indigenous homesteading in the early 20th century. The reason why I am curtailing that is because I cannot recall whether or not that was a case study that was linked to the Dawes Act of 1886 or 1888. The Dawes Act of 1886 or 1888, I forget the years there, is a law signed into effect that is predicated on the idea of splitting up reservations that have already been established into private land holdings for individual indigenous families. Now, I forget the precise language associated with that as well. But then, any land left over is made available for homestead. Now, what that does as a net effect is really, it's widely recognized as disenfranchising indigenous peoples of the best land within reservations, as well as reducing the reservation as a nation's economic and political autonomy. And a lot of the times it had a massive negative impact on reservations' long-term developments, to be layered on a whole lot of other things. And so that's why I can only speak in generalities in terms of that particular case study, because I don't remember its linkages to the Dawes Act. But then that is a form that might get talked about as homesteading by somebody who isn't involved in the legal scholarship, and the Dawes Act might be understood as a form of homesteading when it's not, right? Instead, it is rather something that assigns land to private families or individual families, but then removes a lot of acreage from reservations and opens it up to Euro-American homesteading. That's why you see the land rushes in Oklahoma, things like that.
Okay, I'll give the class one more opportunity to see if there's any questions. You can either put them in the chat box or just unmute your microphone and ask Rob directly.
So I see Bill put on the link to the homestead place, and it says it's Homestead Days. Is that what's going on in the background? It started today through for a couple more days.
Yeah, so if I can offer a little panic here, we've got 3 days of massive events going on right now. So this is the first day, and right outdoors, I think we've got over 150 preschoolers listening to a violin performance.
Oh my gosh.
Tomorrow, I'll be dressed as a homesteader and rolling down on a float in the middle of the town of Beatrice, where the streets are going to be packed with activities. And then on site, we've got a number of speakers and performers and craftspeople, I think over 24. And then our keynote speaker is Sean Astin, who is, I know him from being Samwise Gamgee in the Lord of the Rings trilogy for the films. But apparently he is a real genealogy buff, and he will be presenting on his experiences conducting genealogical research on his family tomorrow here at 2 p.m. And that's just a drop in the bucket. We expect somewhere between 500 and 2,000 people to be on site. And then the town of Beatrice will have 2,000 to 5,000 more people in the town than it usually has for about 3 days. So yeah. He was the keynote speaker at Roots Tech, and that's why he's here now.
Thank you, George. That's good information to know. And I don't suppose, Rob, that any of this is going to be broadcasted through Zoom or anything live?
Not to my knowledge as being broadcasted live. There may be something uploaded later, but that's pretty hit or miss at the moment. And our key coordinator for Homestead Days, I'm just letting her focus on her work right now. But I can follow up if you shoot me an email and provide those links if they're on the broadcast.
Great. Okay. All
So
right. Well, oh, go ahead.
Can I ask one more question? So are you gonna and I haven't looked at this in a while, but do you do any of your presentations that you do there in the conference room? Are you gonna do any of those Zoom so people like us could watch them? You know, because it's not the easiest place to get to your place.
I think we can do that. Our forthcoming calendar of events is going to hollow out for a little bit after Homestead Days, and I'm unaware of any like keynote speakers or anything for Homestead Days occurring in our multi-purpose room where recording would be really high quality.
Right.
In the winter months, it is dependent on the preference of the ranger and or the presenter. So we have to
Right.
double everybody, much like the process that occurred here. So yeah.
Right. Well, it's just, I mean, since you are you are the Homestead, National Park, you represent tons and tons of states, and it would just be great to hear more of it, more for people like me. I mean, right now I'm in Hawaii. There's no way I can't get there, but I'd love to hear more presentations. So you did a great job. Thanks, Rob.
And you can follow up with any emails about nitty-gritty stuff related to the presentation direct to me. I might not get back to you immediately, and sometimes .gov emails can get into spam. But if you have any further questions that I didn't cover today, I am happy to answer them via that email. So thank you all very much. This is a really wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Rob. And before I say goodbye, let me remind the class that we go on for several more hours with the second half of class, where we're all going to work on our family trees together. So I invite everyone to stay. And Rob, thank you very much. I just can never learn enough about homesteading. I just learn something new every time I hear a presentation. So thank you for your expertise.
It's fun to work with audiences who challenge that expertise and force me to think in new ways. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Rob. And I'll stop the recording.
Take care.
Bye-bye.